Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to share, to highlight the science of diversity with you, the scientific writers. I'd like to tell you about the discovery of a new physiological pathway that we've coined the potassium switch that may explain why the Western diet, which is high in sodium and low in potassium, may feed the fire of hypertension, and why this might explain the significant racial disparity of the disease. Hypertension is a common disease affecting over 1 billion people on the planet. It's often called the silent killer. It gradually wreaks havoc on the cardiovascular system and kidneys. According to the World Health Organization, hypertension is the greatest contributor to premature death and disability in the world. The disease has a significant racial disparity. It's much more prevalent in African Americans, and usually its consequences are generally more severe. It can be hard to treat because it requires multiple drugs. At present, there's no definitive way to tell which person must receive the right drugs to respond best to a given therapy. Its etiologies, its root causes are really unknown, but it's suspected to be rooted in genetic susceptibilities in environmental or dietary stresses. Amongst the dietary stresses, and as nicely demonstrated in this large epidemiological study of over almost 500,000 people worldwide, and this interventional study done at Johns Hopkins by the DASH research group shows that blood pressure increases as salt consumption increases. I think we all know that salt is bad for your blood pressure. But what isn't so well appreciated is growing evidence that potassium, dietary potassium, has an equally important role. High potassium reduces blood pressure, and it seems to reduce the sensitivity to salt. But low dietary potassium increases blood pressure, and this increases the sensitivity to sodium. This is especially problematic because the modern diet is typically high in sodium and low in potassium. A recent study published last month suggests the higher salt sensitivity and blood pressure in African Americans is largely due to dietary potassium deficiency. The mechanisms underlying this effect of potassium are likely to be multifactorial and complex, but we began to wonder if it's rooted in the way that the kidney handles blood potassium levels over a very narrow range, despite wide variations in dietary potassium consumption. Potassium is the most abundant mineral in the body. Most of it's stored inside of cells. It charges and affect the body's battery, important for many body functions, including nerve impulses, the regular heart rhythm, muscle contraction, insulin release, just to name a few. Now, for the battery to work right, blood levels of potassium must be kept low within a very, very narrow range, only about 1.5 millimole, despite wide variations in dietary potassium consumption. As it turns out, if you're eating the daily recommended potassium, you're taking in almost over twice as much that's confined in the extracellular fluid compartment. Yet the kidney, because the kidney excretes the potassium load, these potassium levels are maintained in a constant level. Now, this is especially impressive if you consider our not too distant evolutionary past. The ancient diet contained over 3 times the amount of the daily recommended modern diet, and even more if you consider how deficient the Western diet is. And this occurs in times of feast, but in times of periodic or seasonal famine, our ancient ancestors consumed no potassium at all, yet somehow the kidney can respond to this huge variation in potassium intake and maintain potassium levels constant for the body's battery to work. I should also add that the ancient diet contained very, very little sodium at all. So it's the job of the kidney to maintain potassium balance. Really, the kidney is the body's master chemist. It contains about 1 million functional units, microscopic units that are about a couple inches long and maybe about the 1/10 of a diameter of a human hair. They consist of a filtration unit, which filters about 150 liters of blood a day. And then that filtrate is processed along the nephron so that you only urinate about a quarter to 2 liters a day. Now, most of you think of the kidney as doing a job to remove waste, but its chief function is as this master chemist, which maintains electrolyte balance like potassium, acid-base balance, water, and it has an important say in blood pressure control. There's over 15 different cell types that line the nephron, each equipped with a plethora of different transport molecules that serve the function to process the urine in order to maintain all of the blood chemistries. These transport molecules are sometimes mutated in human disease, and many of them are targets of common drugs that are used to treat high blood pressure and other disorders called diuretics. It's the distal part of the nephron that maintains potassium balance. According to the textbook view, potassium is transported into the urine from the blood in exchange for sodium in these cells that are sensitive to a salt balance hormone called aldosterone that's released from the adrenal gland in response to a potassium-rich diet. This stimulates these cells so that they can exchange sodium for potassium excretion. This may seem somewhat counterproductive, this exchange, but it's ideally suited for the feast of the ancient diet, retaining sodium, which is deficient in the diet, for potassium that's plentiful. Now, in recent years, we've come to discover that cells just upstream from these aldosterone-sensitive cells also have an important role in potassium excretion. These cells are the distal convoluted cells, and these cells reabsorb sodium and chloride together from the forming prourine. As it turns out, these cells are under the control of a molecular circuit that we call the potassium switch that turns on and off sodium balance or sodium reabsorption to control potassium secretion. When you go on a fast or eat a potassium deficient diet, the potassium switch turns on to reabsorb more salt from the prourine, and thus less sodium is delivered downstream and less potassium is excreted. Just what you want to do in the setting of a fast, to retain lots of salt and excrete very little potassium. Now, insights into the switch mechanism were developed because a human disease revealed a molecule that seemed to be the essence of the switch. So this disease called Gordon syndrome is a very rare disease of a genetic intolerance to dietary potassium and sodium. These folks develop very high levels of potassium, have a tremendous salt sensitivity, and a high blood pressure. And interestingly, the disease is corrected by giving a thiazide diuretic, which inhibits transport in the distal convoluted cells, those cells that harbor the switch mechanism. Now, groups around the world, including my group, set out to explore why this gene that is mutated in the disease causes the disease. And the central gene that is mutated is called the with no lysine kinase. It gets its name because it lacks a critical amino acid lysine in the place that all other kinases have this lysine, but it's still functional. And these all kinases act as intracellular signaling molecules, whereby they chemically modify enzymes and other proteins by adding a phosphate residue. And often this causes the enzyme or activity of the protein to change from off state to an on state. So the critical question for us is, why do the Wnt kinases cause this disease? And this led to the discovery of intricate signaling circuit within the DCT cells, the distal convoluted cells, that consist of an ion channel on the basolateral membrane, the membrane that faces the blood, that senses potassium. The Wnt kinases are a part of a relay system consisting of multiple kinases that translate the change in potassium outside of the cell to the signaling system, which activates the salt transporter that is sensitive to the diuretic drugs. Now, this is perfectly suited when you're eating a low potassium diet to activate the salt transporter to limit potassium excretion. The problem is when we are eating too much salt, this activates the salt absorption and can lead to hypertension. So we've taken many approaches to try to understand exactly what the switch mechanism is doing. One of our favorite approaches is to use genetic engineering like CRISPR and other approaches to engineer mutations in the switch pathway and then do physiological phenotyping on the genetically engineered mice to inquire how the switch is working. In this case, we've implanted pressure measuring devices into the carotid artery of the mice and use telemetry to measure blood pressure on a minute-to-minute basis. When mice, wild-type mice or control mice, are fed a low potassium diet, their blood pressure increases a little bit, just like it does in humans. But when they give the high salt diet, the blood pressure increases even more, just like seen in humans. And this increase in sensitivity is coincident with activation of the switch pathway. Now we can genetically engineer the switch to be off and then measure blood pressure the same way. And what you notice is when the switch is genetically engineered so that it's off, the blood pressure doesn't change at all to either high salt or potassium, indicating that the switch pathway is driving the response. And we can genetically lock the switch on, and this causes the mice to be super sensitive to salt, but not to potassium at all. So what are the practical implications of this switch? It seems that the switch is best suited for the caveman diet to get rid of that potassium and retain sodium in times of feast. And then to switch on sodium retention and potassium retention in times of famine. So it works perfectly well. The problem is the modern diet is deficient in potassium and contains even more sodium than potassium. So this feeds the fire of hypertension. So what are the practical implications? It's to eat the DASH diet, which is has less sodium and is potassium rich. For many people who live in food deserts, this isn't so easy, and so interventions need to be applied to find ways to get people to more healthy diets. I'd like to thank my colleagues from around the world who are joined together through the Leduc Foundation to study the switch pathway, and my team here at Hopkins. We're funded also by the National Institutes of Health. Thank you for your attention. Happy to take questions.
Great, thanks very much, Paul, for a wonderful talk with important implications for thinking about health and various disparities in our society. While I'm waiting for questions that may come up in the Q&A, I'd kind of like to get your impression with respect to approaching this issue, considering, pharmacological interventions for this switch versus, dietary changes themselves. As you mentioned, oftentimes the dietary changes have difficulties with respect to food deserts, but I'm wondering about sort of the impact of one approach versus the other, particularly as we look at populations from young to old as they try to deal with this sort of imbalance.
So components of this pathway are druggable, and we are trying to study which components of the pathway may be the best drug target. So I think that there is a use for drug modalities to tweak the switch, especially for people that maybe have a certain sensitivity to the switch. We know they exist. There are common mutations and components of the switch pathway. So tailoring the drug to the right people may be the best way to do this. But I think as a global kind of intervention, the dietary piece is probably will be more impactful. But as I said, it's not so easy. Processing of foods really puts lots of sodium in and takes out the potassium. So the feat to do that isn't as simple as it sounds.
Great, thanks. There's a question in the chat from Joyce Frieden. Is potassium supplementation helpful in dealing with this imbalance?
So we don't know the answer to that. Most of the interventions have been done with food. So just providing food is sufficient to lower blood pressure, food that's rich in potassium. Just taking a pill of potassium, we don't know. Usually the pills that you can buy over the counter don't have really sufficient amounts of potassium. Those people that have kind of hereditary disorders of potassium deficiency have to have prescribed levels of potassium. And so that isn't so easy to do. Right now, there are some trials going on to see if there is some benefit in doing that. I should say that there is some nervousness about doing that. Potassium, you don't want potassium to rise to potentially lethal levels. So just giving out potassium may not be the right thing to do.
Great. There's a related question here. I think you've kind of answered this. The question is, do you think clinicians treating hypertension are paying enough attention to advising increased potassium intake versus limiting sodium when they give dietary advice to patients? I guess that question could kind of be extended to ask, to what extent do you think the clinical community is aware of this imbalance and these effects involving potassium in treatment?
I think with the discovery of the mechanism, it is becoming clinicians are becoming more aware that there is real biology here that's driving the disease. And I think with the awareness of the mechanism, it is being prescribed more. Now, I think the dietary and lifestyle interventions for treating blood pressure are often discussed with the patient, but these are very difficult to implement. If you have high blood pressure and you go to your doctor, you're probably given a sheet with the DASH diet on it, and you know what you do with the sheet when you walk home. You put it in the drawer and don't pay any attention to it. So I think more effort needs to be given to the importance of dietary interventions. Often they lower blood pressure to about the same extent as the first line drug that you get. So I think to be aware and patient education is really going to be an important piece of this.